So let's take a look at this function problem here. So part A, we're given this f function here, root x minus 3 for x is greater than or equal to 3. And they're asking us to find the inverse of f, okay? So to find the inverse of f, remember the first thing is f of x, we can think of that as y, right? So whenever you're trying to find the inverse of this function, first we're going to switch x and y. So we'll get x is equal to the square root of y minus 3. And then just do whatever algebra work you need to get the y by itself. So the first thing I need to get rid of this square root, so I'm going to square both sides. So I'll get x squared is equal to y minus 3. Then I add 3 to the other side, so I'll get x squared plus 3 is equal to y. So once y is by itself, then you can replace it with the inverse notation. So f inverse is going to equal x squared plus 3. Okay? So whenever you need to find the inverse of a function algebraically, just follow those steps right there. Let's take a look at part B now. So part B says, find g compose f of 28. So remember we work inside out. So the first thing is we need to calculate what this is going to be right here. Okay? So we're going to find out what f of 28 is. So what's f of 28? So in the f function, we're going to plug in 28 wherever there's an x, minus 3. So we'll get the square root of 25, which we know is 5. So once we have the answer to this is 5. That means we're going to plug that into the g function. So g of 5 is equal to, right, now the g function we know is 5 squared, so wherever there's an x, replace it with 5. 5 squared plus 1, so we're going to end up with 26. Okay? Part C, right, so part C says, write down the range of the inverse, okay? So you have to remember, the range of the inverse, this would be the domain of f of x, right? So the range of the inverse would be the domain of f of x. And they actually gave us the domain of f of x earlier, right? This right here, when they tell you this, they're saying this is the domain of the f function. So that means for the range of the inverse, we're just going to have y greater than or equal to 3, right? So we have y because anytime you work with range, remember it represents the y-axis, okay? So whenever they have these domain range questions, right, you should usually always think about the original function, right? So if they're asking for the range of the inverse, that means go to the original function, go to the f function, and find the domain for it, okay? And then over here, write down the range of g, all right? For C2, they want us to give the range of the g function, okay? Now the g function we know is a quadratic. If you just think of the g function right here, this, if we were to graph it, just make a sketch, we know basically it's just a parabola, right, where the vertex moves up 1. So it's just a parabola where the vertex moves up 1 like this, okay? So the range is, well, what's the lowest this graph goes? The lowest it goes to is positive 1 on the y-axis, right? And then it goes up forever. So the range of the g function, right, is going to be y is greater than or equal to 1. Okay? Alright, so let's take a look at this other function problem. So part A here says find f inverse of 3. So first of all, we need to find the inverse of f. So here's our f function, and here's the domain for our f function. So f of x is the same thing as y, and the first step we need to switch the x and the y in order to find the inverse. So we get x is equal to the square root of y plus 7. Now we're going to square both sides, so we get x squared is equal to y plus 7. And then now let's get y by itself by subtracting 7. Oops. Then we've got y by itself. Now once y is by itself, then we can replace it with the inverse notation, so we know this is f inverse now. Now we're evaluating, all right, f inverse of 3. So now that we know what the inverse function is, f inverse of 3 is going to equal 3 squared minus 7. So that's 9 minus 7, so we're going to get 2. So we know f inverse of 3 is going to equal 2. Okay, so that's part A. Let's take a look at part B now. Let me erase this real quick. So part B says we have a g function, all right, such that the inverse of g exists for all real numbers, okay? So given that g of 9 is equal to 4, they want us to find g inverse of 4, right? Well, f composed g inverse of 4, okay? So what you need to understand is, well, if g of 9 is equal to 4, that means g inverse of 4 would equal 9, right? So when you're trying to calculate this right here, we know that this is going to equal 9. So that means we're supposed to take 9 and just plug it into the f function, right? So f of 9, the f function, so we have the square root of 9 plus 7, so that's the square root of 16, which is going to give us 4. Okay, so that's all that is right there. And then part C, find the domain and range of the inverse. Okay, domain and range of the inverse. So first of all, our f function, right? We know the domain of the f function is right here. So if this is the domain of the f function, that means this will be the range of the inverse. So right away, without doing any work, we know the range, right, for f inverse. The range is going to be, now just use y, since it's the range, y greater than or equal to -7. Okay? So the domain of f of x will be the range of f inverse. Okay? Now, let's think of the graph for this. So the graph for this is basically, it's going to be a shifted to the left, a -7 right here. And basically we have a square root graph will just look something like this, right? So that means the range of f of x here, so the range of f of x would be y is greater than or equal to 0. So this is the range of f of x. Well, we know the range of f of x will become the domain of the inverse. So that means we're going to get x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at this next problem here regarding functions. So this time we're given this graph, right? So the following diagram shows the graph of y equals f of x between this interval -5 and 2 inclusive. It says write down the value of, right? So f of -2. So this just means, all right, think of this as the x value, right? So on the x-axis, go to -2, right? Here's -2 on the x-axis. Go to wherever it touches the graph. It touches the graph right here. And what's the corresponding y value? It's -2. Okay? F of 1. So f of 1, that means we're supposed to go to 1 on the x-axis. Go to where it touches the graph right here. Right? And the corresponding y value is +1. Okay? And then it says sketch the graph of f inverse on the same grid. Okay, so when you're doing this, when you want to sketch the inverse, what I would do first is I would recommend finding a few points, right, for f of x. So for example, right here, I know this coordinate. I would use maybe this coordinate. I can use this coordinate right here. Maybe use another one over here, and this one right here. So basically we have 2, right? So we have x, when x is 2, this value here is going to be 3.5, right? Over here we have x is 0, -1.5, 0, -1.5. And then this value here, x is -4, and we get -2.5. So at -4, we get -2.5, right? So if these are the coordinates of f of x, now remember the idea with inverse, the x's and the y's switch. So that means for the inverse, right? Let's say for the inverse, so f inverse, these coordinates need to switch. So this would be 3.5 for x, and then y would be 2. All right, x would be negative 1.5, y would be 0. And then x would be negative 2.5, and y would be negative 4. And then we just plot these points. So 3.5, all right, 2, so 3.5 right here, and 2, that would be right here. We've got negative 1.5 and 0, negative 1.5, negative 1.5, and 0 would be right here, right? And then we have negative 2.5, so negative 2.5 and negative 4. Negative 2.5 and negative 4 is right here, right? And what we want to do is just make some lines and connect the points. So I'll connect the points with some lines right here. I'm going to go kind of right here. Okay, so here's our inverse right here function. So this would be f inverse right here in red. Okay, and you notice if you look at it, it looks like both of these graphs reflect over the line y equals x, which is what should happen. All right, so let's take a look at this other function problem. So basically this problem here, sometimes you're going to be given a table, all right, of values in the function, and then they're going to ask you to just find some specific, functions. For example, A here, they want us to find the value of f of 2, right? So remember, this is your x value. So that means that x is going to be 2, and we want to go to the f function. So when x is 2 for the f function, we know y is going to be 0. So we know this is going to be 0. Okay? So these are really easy marks right here. Now we have this composition. So remember, every time you're working with a composition, you want to work inside out. So we need to calculate whatever this is going to be first. Okay? So whatever this is going to be right here, we need to figure out what this is going to be. So f of 2, so when x is 2, what's the f function? 0. So the answer to this here is 0. So that means now we're going to plug this into the g function. So now we're calculating g of 0. So when the x is 0, what's the g value? So g of 0 is going to give us negative 1. So this is going to be our solution for b. Okay? Down here, now the inverse. So you have to be careful. The inverse of g of 5. Now you have to think of this right here. If this is the inverse right here, so this is not your x, you have to think of this as like y. Okay? This is like the y, okay, because the x is in the y switch. So when the y is 5, right? So for the g function, right? So when is the y value 5? This is when the y value is 5, and then the x that corresponds with that is negative 4, right? So g inverse of 5 is equal to negative 4. Okay? So when this is the inverse, this value here, you have to think of it as the y value, and this is the x. Because this means that g of negative 4 is equal to 5, because if this is the g function, this would be the x, and this would be the y. Remember, for inverses, the x's and the y's, they swap, right? They switch.